Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
After the Night Rolls In, Volume 3, Story Number 1. Okay, here it goes. I have a medical background and a certification I rarely use, though I keep going back and paying to renew it. Anyhow, I volunteered almost immediately thinking I would help those who lived through Katrina. That was not the case. There were a few of us who were assigned once the water started to recede to find houses that had dead bodies in them. If you've ever had to do body recovery when it has been lying around in the heat and the water for days, sometimes weeks at a time, you know how it smells. It does sort of smell like any other dead carcass, but worse. I can't explain it. Maybe somehow sweeter smelling? Anyway, the key to not vomiting when you smell them is Vicks under and around the bottom of your nose. It doesn't keep the smell out, but enough until you can at least tolerate the smell without vomiting. We had to go to each house and go inside in wading boots and look for bodies. Many of them washed out to sea, but some were still in the houses they had lived in prior to the hurricane. If we found a body, we spray painted a big X on the outside of the house. This other guy and I had been doing it for a while, and we got assigned to work with each other almost every day. We got along okay, and he didn't vomit at the ones that had been gotten to. We came up to this one old shack. I say shack because it was pretty run down in what had been a very bad neighborhood. Right away, I got chills down my spine. I knew there was something really wrong. Not like find a body kind of wrong, but chilling kind of wrong. New Orleans has certain areas that just give off these vibes, and my understanding is there's a lot of voodoo practice in certain areas. Anyway, against everything my body was screaming at me, we went in the house. The first thing I could smell was a body. The second was something almost earthy and mold. I looked at my partner. Let's call him Jay. He was as white as a sheet. I could tell he was getting that same feeling I had been getting. It was obvious from the weird bones hanging from the ceiling. I would bet money they were cats. Something odd had been going on in the house, as well as strange beads and carvings in the bare wood in the walls. We went into what was a kitchen, and there chained to a beam was an old lady, or what was left of her. She had chained herself by her wrist to the beam. Her guts were falling out on the floor. The creepiest thing was her face still looked as though she were alive, and staring at us with a wicked smile, showing only partial teeth. They were nubs. My skin started crawling as the goosebumps spread over my body and my neck hair stood up. Suddenly I heard the most unearthly cackling noise I've ever heard in my life, and my flight or fight kicked in. Jay and I got out of there quick. We painted an X and literally ran to the next house. Now, I don't know if that old lady had practiced voodoo or whatever, but that scared the ever-living you-know-what out of me. It still gives me nightmares. The people I feel sorry for are the ones who had to take that crazy lady out of there. Jay and I discussed it that night after we went back to the hotel. He had heard the cackling too, but we both said it had to be the wind or something. But we knew better. Story number 2. My best friend was doing cleanup construction after Katrina in the lower Ninth Ward. He was operating a backhoe. A lot of the doors and windows to those little shotgun houses have bars on them. The people that were going house to house looking for bodies and marking the houses couldn't get into a house, so they asked my friend to rip the bars off with his backhoe. He said that when he took the bars off, half of the wall came off too. He said that the feeling that washed over him when that door came off was like something he's never felt before. He said the best he could describe it was a mix between electricity, sadness, and depression. He said he sat on his machine for a few minutes looking into the house at what he thought was a person standing in the entryway smiling at him, only to realize that it was a dead body draped over a chair. He asked for a transfer after that. Couldn't mentally handle the sight of a dead body or the feelings that came over him. You can't get him to talk about it anymore. He won't even go to New Orleans. The closest he will get during Mardi Gras is Metairie. Next story. This incident happened when I was about 20 years old. This may not be considered paranormal, but I just can't find any explanation of the evidence. While on a Christmas break, I went to visit relatives in Leyte Island, Philippines. It was not unusual for groups of neighbors and cousins to stay outdoors past bedtime to talk about nothing, play some street games, or just admire a few Christmas lights that were up at the time. On this particular night, our street game was interrupted by a passing tricycle, which stopped at a dilapidated house a few meters away. Since this town is quite rural and everyone knows everyone else, the sight of the tricycle that late in the night sparked my cousin's curiosity. So they flagged down the tricycle driver and asked him what he was up to. The driver said he was just dropping off his passengers from the pier. Now, we were all watching the tricycle from the time he drove by, when he stopped momentarily along the curb in front of that vacant house, to the time he made a U-turn and talked to us. Not one of us had seen any passenger or anyone getting out of his vehicle. So we all thought the driver was just messing with us. My male cousin pressed for more. At that time I could tell that the driver was equally confused and exasperated with our questions. So he said, "Look, I was about to call it a night, but the couple at the pier convinced me to drive them here because they, including the boy, were all wet and don't have anywhere to stay in the city. They gave me a good sum of money, so I said, okay. The money they paid me was even wet. Look, in fact, the bills were damp. There were watermarks on the seats and puddles of water where their shoes were supposed to be." Then I saw my cousin really freak out. They asked the driver to describe the couple and the boy. Apparently the description fit the family who used to live in that now vacant house who perished in the Doña Paz tragedy 3 years before. For a bit of history, the Doña Paz was an overcrowded passenger ship which collided with another ship one night in December 1987 in the Philippines, where more than 4,000 people died, including the neighbors of my relatives who used to live 2 doors down. Next story. I grew up in the Philippines and I'm used to powerful typhoons crossing our country. While my hometown is rarely visited by typhoons due to its geographical location nearer to the equator, watching the news about the aftermath of the typhoon, that was just a mundane scene. But on November 8th, 2013, the entire country was reeling from what could have been the strongest typhoon of the century. Super Typhoon Yolanda wreaked unimaginable havoc in central Philippines. Tacloban City, the regional center of Region 8, was the worst hit. The disaster claimed more than 10,000 lives, destroyed millions of dollars worth of crops and properties, and displaced millions of people. The locals are used to typhoons as the region is located at the eastern seaboard of the country. However, everyone got caught off guard by the storm surge. No one was aware about the imminent danger days before Haiyan struck the region. No one listened nor cared about the impending danger of the storm surge, which was reiterated a number of times by National Weather Bureau. Thousands of rotting corpses lay along the highway towards the airport, which is located at the peninsular part of the city, sandwiched by 2 bodies of water. Search and rescue operations were futile as well. The entire city reeked of death and despair. It felt like it was a scene straight out of a high-budget Hollywood disaster movie, only that this one happened in real life. Horrible was an understatement. On March 2nd, 2014, I moved to Tacloban City. It was my first facility assignment after I finished my training as an air traffic controller. First job, first facility assignment. I was feeling excited at that time, and all the terrible things I'd read and heard about the city were briefly covered over by the excitement. The city during that time still had an unstable electricity connection, except for the airport. As days turned into night, the city was plunged into darkness, and it became eerily quiet. I stayed at the 3rd floor of the control tower, since the staff house was totally damaged by the storm surge. On the 3rd night, I woke up at exactly 3 in the morning. As I opened my eyes, I saw a tall, dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was our office assistant. We were 3 in the room that time. The figure wasn't moving, and I felt like it was staring at me. The room was dimly lit, all thanks to the moon's illumination, but it was as clear as day that the figure wasn't our office assistant. I just shrugged it off, thinking that my mind was just playing tricks. The next day, I told my experience to my other roommate, my colleague, and happens to have a strong 6th sense. She nonchalantly said, We're six inside our room. The other three are just lost souls. Probably typhoon victims. Just pray. The hair on my arms just rose. Weeks later, my colleague and I were the only ones inside the room. We were both on our laptops doing our own business when suddenly we smelled something. It was a sharp, distinct smell of an orchid. I got anxious and asked my colleague if she smelled something. From her body language, I could sense she was really scared. She leaned on me and whispered, "She's in front of you. Don't forget to pray for her eternal repose." I thought she was joking, but I was feeling cold that time. I prayed hard that night. The following day, I asked one of the airport employees if he knew someone who loved orchids. "We have a former employee who used to plant orchids and other flowers near the control tower. She died during Yolanda," he said. The hauntings continued, but eventually I got used to it. I occasionally go to the city's cathedral and light a candle for the eternal repose of the lost souls around the airport. Fast forward to November 7, 2014. On the eve of the Yolanda Haiyan anniversary, I rode a jeepney from downtown to the airport. It was just one ride away, around 30 minutes with traffic. For those who don't know, a jeepney is an ubiquitous mode of transportation in the Philippines. Passengers would sit in front of each other, and the jeep usually has a capacity of 20 passengers, 10 on each side. I was at downtown doing some errands. By 6 p.m. it was getting dark, and I hailed a jeep that would take me straight to the airport. The airport is the last stop, so basically, most passengers would alight before me. As we neared the airport, we were only four left inside the jitney. I was seated near the driver while the other three were seated at the middle part. As we neared the airport, the highway became dark. The streetlights weren't working, and there were only a few people walking around the street. The three other passengers, two adults, male and female, and one male child, probably 7 or 8 years old, were dressed in an ordinary way. Nothing spectacular, to be honest. I assumed they were local fishermen along the area. Suddenly the adult male shouted, "Lugar lang," which means that the driver should stop, since the family would alight in the next few seconds. I thought the driver didn't hear, maybe because of the loud roar of the Jeep's engine, so I told him to stop. He did and asked me, "You going down, kid? I thought you were going to alight at the airport." I told him that the three passengers would alight here, not me. What he did next was truly terrifying. He started to speed up. The road was still dark, however, from the distance I could already see the runway lights. We were near the airport. I could sense something was wrong. The other passengers were nowhere to be found, and I thought they went down when the Jeep stopped momentarily a few minutes before. The driver didn't utter a word. I began to break into a cold sweat. My heart began to pound. When we finally arrived at the airport, the facade of the terminal was brightly illuminated by LED lights. Finally, I saw his face. He was terrified. I gave him the fare and told him something that made my hair raise. He said, "You were completely alone even before the dim part of the road. When you told me someone will light, I sped up. I've heard stories from other drivers, just like this one. Did you see them?" I nodded nervously. "They might be those ones of the typhoon victims. Some say they aren't aware they're already dead. Please pray for their eternal repose." As I alighted, I noticed that the seat where the other passengers sat a while ago was wet. It didn't rain that time. It seemed that someone spilled a bottle of water or something. It then dawned on me they were indeed the lost souls of the area. I remembered that the entire city was inundated by a storm surge, as tall as a 3-story building. Next story. Okay, bear with me. This is my wife's side of the family. I don't know who the picture is of. It's an old black and white of a young man, portrait style, easily 4 or 5 generations ago. Distant enough that we don't know the name of the clean-cut, suit-wearing teen 20-something. We just know not to mess with this picture. It's hanging in the basement of a house her aunt lives in. The aunt's elderly, and I'll refer to her as great aunt, who just passed at 101 years of age. She's lived there all her life, and when her husband passed 15 years ago, my wife's aunt, I'll call her aunt, moved in to take care of her. Not much other family, so when aunt passed, we know it'll come to us. So why is it haunted? Again, it's of a young man who we know tragically drowned in the river across the street. Not sure if he was fishing, swimming, or what, but he went under, didn't come up until he was found the next morning. I know the picture itself killed someone in the 60s when my father-in-law and his friend had stopped over to visit great aunt, and the friend asked about the picture. My father-in-law told the story, and the friend started mocking the kid. How can you drown in the river? You can see your own house right there. You can't stand, it's only knee deep. What an idiot, etc. 2 days later, he was walking and slipped, hit his head on a railing, landed face down in a puddle, and drowned in 2 inches of water. In the 80s, that story was being relayed to someone who insisted on seeing the cursed picture. It was shown, and he laughed at the picture and gave it the finger as a tough guy macho challenge. He died in a solo car accident that weekend. No alcohol, not speeding. Police only said he must have lost control on a street that he drove every day to and from work in an area not known for wildlife. So the picture was moved to the basement. Still on display, nobody wants to offend the picture by hiding it, but where nobody would see it but people who knew the story and respected it. Problem is, Aunt is a hoarder. She's old. She's going to die, and we are going to inherit the massive disaster that is the house. And we know we're just going to be either be calling 1-800-GOT-JUNK to have the entire contents hauled away so the house could be gutted, or most likely the house and lot will be sold to developers who will knock it down. But what do we do with the picture? We don't want it in our house. We don't want to destroy it and have the curse pissed at us. Don't want to leave it and let it curse new property owners. How do we get rid of a haunted picture without getting haunted ourselves? Last thing I need is to have a pissed off ghost haunting me over something that happened generations ago. Next story. I lost my home and job in Hurricane Katrina in 2005. I returned to New Orleans a month later to salvage my possessions and found a job doing disaster relief for FEMA. Since 80% of the city's housing was destroyed, it was nearly impossible to find a safe, clean, and affordable place to live. After sleeping in my car and on my friend's couch for several weeks, I found a furnished studio apartment in the French Quarter at a surprisingly low rate. It was filthy, infested with roaches, and had creepy art all over the walls. But it was my only housing option, so I rolled up my sleeves, enthusiastically cleaned and repainted, and moved in. Everything was fine until around Thanksgiving, when someone delivered flowers to the apartment. The card read, "Dear," with a man's name, "rest in peace, love, your family." I figured someone had delivered them to the wrong address, but they looked pretty, so I took them inside and put them in a vase. I later told one of my neighbors about the odd delivery, and he went pale and said, "Oh no, you weren't supposed to take those inside." He then informed me that a very depressed, alcoholic young man had lived there a year ago and hung himself one night in the apartment. The ceiling didn't have enough drop room to break his neck, so he slowly strangled. The neighbors heard him choking and kicking the wall in agony and eventually broke down the door and called 911, but it was too late. His windpipe was crushed and he died in the apartment. After that, the new tenants all complained of paranormal activity, and no one stayed more than a month or two. They all broke the lease and left abruptly, usually leaving all their possessions behind, which is why I got it cheap and furnished. His parents believed the spirit was still there and regularly delivered flowers or gifts to the home, but the neighbors had agreed never to take them inside since it seemed to make the activity worse. Would have been nice to get that memo, but okay. After that, I also began to experience paranormal activity. I woke up hearing a loud rhythmic thumping noise in the walls at the same time every night, right where he'd hung himself. All flowers and plants withered and died within a few hours of bringing them inside the apartment. Objects would move on their own, and anything I hung up on the walls would unscrew itself and crash to the floor. Some nights, the bead curtain between the kitchenette and the main room would move on its own, like someone was walking through. It was creepy, but I decided to endure it since I had nowhere else to live. I'm superstitious, but I'm also pragmatist, and I felt sorry for the young man who died a horrible, lonely death, and his spirit was now trapped within the walls. I would often speak out loud to him, read the notes his family sent to the house, and basically try to befriend him. The neighbors told me he probably enjoyed having a friendly young woman his own age around. I even created a small altar for him with objects I thought would bring him comfort. this all turned out to be a big mistake. The bizarre activity continued to escalate over months, and I became more and more depressed. It wasn't just the apartment. I was working long hours, the city was beyond screwed up, and my disaster relief job was traumatic. Everything culminated in a visit from an old friend, a self-described skeptic and atheist, in the spring of 2006. After one night in my apartment, he moved into a hotel and said, "You shouldn't stay in that place anymore. There's something bad there." A few days later, I was assigned to a nursing home to help the residents process their disaster relief applications. An elderly lady I was working with suddenly stopped and said, "God has given me a word for you. Young lady, you're in danger right now. If you stay where you are any longer, you will die." By that point, I was thoroughly freaked out. I called my landlord and told her I appreciated the cheap place, but I had to move out. She said, "I'm not surprised. I arranged to move in with a friend until I could find a new place." Once I began packing up, the paranormal activity escalated violently. The thumping got louder to the point where I couldn't sleep. I also began to experience sleep paralysis. One night I woke up around the time the thumping usually started, but the room was dead quiet. The bead curtains started moving again, but this time something came through. It was vaguely human-shaped, but it wasn't human. Its body was gray and faded out, like television static or smoke. It had no hands, feet, or face. It moved in an unsettling way, shuffling and stooped and jerky like something very old struggling to walk. I lay there frozen in fear as it moved slowly across the room, eventually standing by the bed behind my head. I leaned over until it loomed inches from my face. It let out a strange high-pitched screech and then whispered something softly. I can't remember what it said, something mildly comforting like, "Don't worry, baby." But as it breathed into my ear, a wave of cold, dark, clammy dread washed over my body. It was the worst sensation I've ever felt in my life. All I can describe it as a feeling of suicide, of dying alone in darkness and terror with no comfort. Then it faded into the wall and disappeared. I jumped out of bed, turned all the lights on, and spent the rest of the night frantically packing and throwing things into my car. I was out by morning and slept at my friend's house that night. Early the next morning, I woke up on her couch with sleep paralysis. There was a doorway in her wall. They shouldn't be there. It turned out there had once been a physical doorway there, but it had been plastered over it into the wall. The old gray thing came through it again. It leaned over me again until it was lying completely on top of me, whispering gentle nonsense in my ear, infecting my entire body with foul, creeping dread. Then it left. My friend woke up shortly afterward and said she had horrible nightmares all night. I threw away every object I owned associated with the apartment and called my mother, a deeply religious woman. "I think a ghost followed me from my old place," I said, and told her everything that had happened. She was alarmed. "That's not a human spirit," she said. "That's something else pretending to be one." She sent me to a priest for a blessing. I saw it a few times after that, but it eventually faded away. It seemed to lose power over me the longer I stayed outside the haunted apartment. Years passed, and eventually I never saw it again. I still own one object from that apartment, though, an artwork that was hanging there when I moved in, that I haven't been able to part with. It reminds me of that scary time, of everything I went through and survived. It's an abstract print of a light-colored piece of textile twisting across a black background. It's vaguely human-shaped, but it isn't human. Next story. I grew up in Northern California for most of my life. I was born in Antioch and was raised there until I was about 8, but my family moved, my brother, sister, and me, I'm the oldest, and their twins, up north in the more mountainous part of California. I was pretty angry about it at first because I had my good buddies at the time and now I had nobody. Eventually, I did make friends. Friends I still have to this day almost 18 years later. When I first moved into the house, I didn't experience much, but when I turned 14, things got kind of strange. Nothing crazy at first, just footsteps when I thought everyone was asleep. Voices in my room that I chalked up to echoes. It was strange nonetheless. My father was the first to experience things. At the time, my dad was a heavy drinker and would oftentimes pass out in the living room or the downstairs entertainment center. One of these nights he passed out in the entertainment center and woke up to look upstairs where a woman was standing at the base of the staircase staring down at him. My father called out to the woman, asking if everything was okay, because he assumed it was my mother. The woman simply turned around and went up the stairs toward all of our bedrooms. My dad got up, went upstairs and to my mom's and his bedroom to find my mom tangled in the blankets, fast asleep. He thought maybe the woman was my sister. When he entered her room and found it empty, remembered she was staying at a friend's house. Everybody kind of shrugged it off as maybe he was dreaming, but it was that same year my whole family was out of the house at my brother and sister parents' teacher conference, and I was home alone talking to friends on MySpace, maybe Facebook. I don't really remember when that transition happened. And my golden retriever was laying beside me. He woke up and decided to go upstairs, but moments after he left, I heard him yelp and he ran down the stairs whining, tail between his legs and pissing the whole way down. I just assumed that one of our two cats had attacked him, so I got on my computer and headed upstairs to take the cats outside since I knew they bullied him and they were better outside than my dog. I was looking down at the stairs as I climbed them, but when I had about 3 or 4 left, I looked up. The top story of our home was where all of our bedrooms were. My sister's was the room directly in front of the staircase. My brother's was to the right, my parents to the left of my sister's, and mine around the corner, parallel with the stairs. When I looked up, my sister's door was cracked open maybe a foot or two, and I saw in that crack a woman's face. She was really pale from what I could tell and had her head down looking at the floor. Moments after I noticed her, she looked up and noticed me. Her face looked like she gasped and then retreated into the darkness of my sister's room. I say looked like she gasped because she made no sounds at all. Terrified, I jumped back downstairs and huddled together with my terrified dog, never taking my eyes off the bottom of the staircase. After a moment or two, I realized that maybe this is somebody breaking into my home and not a ghost. So I gathered my courage and headed upstairs and checked every single bedroom, only to find nobody was there. Please keep in mind, if somebody were to jump from one of those windows, they would have definitely broken a leg. The only way to escape from downstairs was the staircase that had eyes on the entire time before going to investigate. That was the first and only time I ever experienced something like that in that house. I comforted myself by explaining maybe she ran downstairs while I was investigating one of the bedrooms, but it was single-handedly the most spooky experience of my life. Thank God. Oh, and before I forget, there was a cemetery in the forest behind our house. Next story. For some background, my dad's side of the family is Native American, and some have a deep suspicion of owls. They're considered evil omens. Anyway, my grandmother was a very, very attuned person to spirits. She had a so-called second sight. She had a whole wealth of stories of her encounters with the paranormal, which she passed on to my aunt. Now, some of these stories were pretty out there. Anyway, this next bit is relevant. A few months before she passed away from lupus, she woke up in a panic and came running into my aunt's room. My grandmother was generally a stoic, unflappable woman, so this was not like her. She dragged my aunt into her bedroom, asking if she heard it. My aunt heard nothing. What my grandmother had heard was what was called the death owl. She passed on not too long after that. Fast forward about 10 years or so. I'm up around 4 a.m. watching TV. As I recall, it was around December 2008. Anyway, I heard this noise outside. It sounded like a woman weeping. The best way I can describe it was a voice that was caught between an owl's cry and the humans. It was unnatural. I got a cold feeling in my gut because I knew exactly what it was, and it scared the ever-loving shit out of me. I remember being paralyzed with fear. I grew up out in the country, and I know what an owl, we have barn owls and screech owls, sounds like. I've heard bobcats, foxes, and the dying screams of rabbits. This was none of those things. Others have tried to claim it was just an animal, but no animal I've ever heard makes it sound like that. That unearthly wailing noise, like it was in mourning, the kind of sound that freezes the blood in your veins. At the time I thought that it might be foretelling my father's imminent death, since if you hear it, it either means you or a family member is going to die, or portends great disaster. Clarification: at the time, my dad was having some significant heart trouble. He's much better now. Now, here comes the twist. On April 9th, 2009, a huge wildfire swept through my area. A lot of houses burned down, and mine was among them. When we came back, my house was nothing but a pile of smoking rubble. It took me a bit to make the connection, but I am positive that the death owl, or banshee, was an omen that predicted this disaster. One thing's for sure, I hope to God I never hear that thing again, because I will never forget it. I have a suspicion that this thing stalks my family. I can't be certain. I'll have to do some research into my family tree. I know that this might sound unbelievable to some, but I will swear till the day I die that it is all 100% true. So there you have it, folks. My most significant paranormal encounter, and hopefully the last.